Thank you so much. This is on. You can hear me? We're all good? All right. Thank you so much, both of you. It's wonderful to be here at the university. It's wonderful to be here to give the Priestley lecture. I hope I can live up to all of that billing, but you'll be the judge of that. So let me, without further ado, step back and take you with me to my favorite period in ancient history. Some of you love the Hellenistic Greeks, some of you love the Romans. I am going to take you back to the late Bronze Age, which is my favorite period. If I could be reincarnated backwards, I would love to go back to the late Bronze Age. I'm sure I would not be alive for more than about 48 hours. But it would be a lovely 48 hours. I want to meet Akhenaten. I want to meet Hatshepsut. I want to meet Shupi-Luliuma, the king of the Hittites, mostly to ask if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So without further ado, let me take you back into about 3,200 years ago, and we're going to be focusing on both of the books. After 1177 BC is the sequel. 1177 BC is the original, and we're going to be looking at both. Pretty much the first half of the lecture we'll take on the topics in 1177, and then we'll segue, and the second half, or almost the second two-thirds, we'll do the sequel. So basically, we're going to collapse everything and then find out how to survive that. And if there are lessons for today, that would be a plus, right? I think, given what's happening. So let me take you back to the late Bronze Age. It's about 1700 to 1200 BCE, so it's the second millennium, so between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago. And you're looking at the Eastern Mediterranean as well as the Aegean, and all the way, in fact, off the map over to the Western Mediterranean, basically from Italy over to Iraq and Iran in modern terms, and from Turkey down to Egypt. So this is the period when I say the G8 was ruling. Some of them you've heard of, some of them you might not have heard of. Mycenaeans, how many have heard of the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, right? Think Trojan War, right? Agamemnon, all of that. How about the Minoans on Crete? King Minos and all of them? Okay, excellent. How about my good friend Shupi of the Hittites, Shupi-Luliuma of the Hittites up in ancient Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Right, so those are all members of this G8. We've also got the Assyrians and the Babylonians in Mesopotamia, which is like basically modern-day Iraq. And then Egyptians in Egypt, Cypriots in Cyprus, Canaanites in Canaan. So those are the ones that are going to be interacting in our time period that we're going to talk about today. So even if you thought you didn't know this period, trust me, you do know it. This is the time period of the New Kingdom in Egypt, right? How many, in fact, have heard of Hatshepsut, the famous female pharaoh? Good, okay, a knowledgeable audience, I love it. Right, how about her stepson and nephew? He was both, Tutmosis III? A couple of you know? Okay. My favorite guy, Amenhotep III, I wrote my master's thesis on him, perhaps better known as the father of Akhenaten, right? The heretic pharaoh who might have invented monotheism. I don't actually think he did, but it's out there. Who else? Let's see. Probably none of you have heard of this boy king who died young, a guy named King Tut. Anybody ever heard of him? Right, okay. And then Ramses II, and then our hero tonight, Ramses III. So this is the period that we're talking about, and I find that most people at first go, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh wait, yes, I've heard of them. So we're going to be in that period. Now, the interesting thing about this time period is that they are all in contact with each other, either directly or indirectly. And so this is a diagram that my late wife Diane made up for me, showing the globalized network. I mean, it's not globalized like today, where if you have an earthquake off of Japan, it reflects on the New York Stock Exchange 10 minutes later, but the globalized Mediterranean. That's what Sue Sherritt at Sheffield has called it, and I would agree with that. And in particular, what we're looking at is called a small world network. Those of you who do social network analysis are familiar with this. It's basically when everyone in a network is connected, again, either directly or indirectly, and nobody is more than 3 hops from anybody else. So you can see, for example, the Mycenaeans on one side are directly connected to the Hittites on the other, but they're not directly connected to the Assyrians. But you can get from the Mycenaeans to the Egyptians and from them to the Assyrians. So we've got that here. Nobody is more than 3 hops from anybody else. And that's called a small world network. Anybody play the game with Kevin Bacon and the movies he's been in and trying? It's the same type of thing. Right, now why does this matter? Because there hasn't actually been that many times in human history when we've had such a network. Us today, obviously, but also them back then, 3,200 years ago, which is why I think what happened to them, even though it was more than 3,000 years ago, I think it's important what happened to them and how they dealt with it. I think it's more relevant to us today than you might suspect. So that's what I'm going to try and show you in our talk tonight. And you did say I have what, 2 hours, 3 hours, something like that, right? Yeah? Okay. Now I'll try and keep it to about 45 minutes and leave some time for your questions. But if it were up to me, I'd be here till midnight and beyond. But I'll try and keep to the time limit. So first of all, to set everything up, that period from 1700 down to 1200, that 500 years, it was a pretty good period. Everybody is prospering. The weather was good. Everybody was out there. And they were trading with each other. They are in contact commercially. They're in contact diplomatically. Everybody's marrying everybody else's daughter to cement mutual defense treaties, and so on. And we have this from a number of different sets of evidence. Along the top, you can see the Uluburun shipwreck, which went down in about 1300 BC off the coast of what is now Turkey. And we've got the National Geographic reconstruction of what it looked like, and then that black and white photograph in the top right. That is actually diving on the wreck. And you can see the stone anchors going in the middle there. That particular ship is a microcosm of what was going on because they found goods from 7 different cultures on board that ship. And you can actually see in the bottom of the artistic reconstruction some of the things that are there. So that's one bit of evidence. And in fact, the map in the middle, that blue route is what they thought the ship was following when it went down one dark and stormy night. That's all they can figure. So we've also got tablets like the Amarna archives, which is my most recent book, but also archives from the Hittites up in Turkey, and especially archives from Ugarit on what is now the coast of North Syria. And so we've got evidence for trade and diplomatic embassies from that. We've also got Egyptian wall paintings. In this particular case, this is from a tomb of one of the viziers in Egypt from the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, so 15th century BC. And you're actually looking at people from the Aegean bringing gifts to the pharaoh in there. And then my personal favorite, you see the sandals down bottom. Don't pay attention to the fact that they're both for the right foot. I stole it off the internet, so I don't take any blame for it. But there is, in an archive that was found at the site of Mari, which is on the river Euphrates in what is now Syria. It dates a little bit earlier, it dates to about 1800 BC. But in there it talks about a pair of Minoan sandals that have been sent from Crete that were taken all the way to Hammurabi in Babylon. And yes, that's the Hammurabi, the law code guy with eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And it says Hammurabi got them and he returned them. And I've always wondered why. I mean, at the very least, they had distance value, right? And I mean, he could have said, look, I mean, these are 2 last millennium, or they're too small. But had he not heard of regifting, right? I'm like, oh my word. And so I'm teaching ancient Near East and Egypt this semester, and we just did Hammurabi about 2 weeks ago. And I said to them, okay, here's the full text. There are 272 or 282 laws there. Find me the penalty for returning a gift. And they came back the next class very crestfallen and said, we can't find it. I said, that's because there's no law against it. So Hammurabi got away with it. So that's my best example of how they're no different from us today, right? How many of you have gotten a gift that you didn't like? right? We all have. How many of you have regifted it or at least returned it to the store, right? So they were more like us than you might imagine. They had magnificent marriages. They had distinctly unpleasant divorces. They had embassies. They had embargoes. They've got everything else that we've got today, and they collapsed. Everything was doing great till about 1200 or a little bit afterward. Call it, oh, I don't know, 1177 perhaps. And then what had been around and was surviving for 500 years, within just a couple of decades, it was all gone. That globalized network that connected them, that was broken. It took 400 years to reestablish it. And the individual societies had to deal with the aftermath of the collapse. So what I want to do in the first part of the talk, as I said, is show you why the collapse might have happened. But that's hypothetical. I could be very, very wrong. So, but I'm going to tell you what I think, and then we will segue to how they managed or tried to come up afterward. So, if we start out, the first thing I have to tell you is that this was huge. When my kids were younger, they used to talk about things being ginormous. This would be a ginormous collapse, right? The only thing it's comparable to is the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, one thing to note, though, there was about 1,500 years between the collapse of the Late Bronze Age and the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. It has now been another 1,500 years since Rome fell, basically, if you don't count the 1,000 years in Byzantium, but Rome itself. So it's been another 1,500 years. I'm not one that really thinks history repeats, but I do think it rhymes. So I'm a little worried that we might be due for another collapse anyway, but we'll get to that. Okay, so that's where all this came from. The original book came out in 2014, and it wasn't actually my idea to write it. Rob Tempio at Princeton came to me in about 2007 and said, can you write a book about the collapse of the Bronze Age? And I said, can I? Sure. There's a lot of people that can write it. And he says, will you? I said, no, I don't want to. And he's like, why don't you want to write a book about it? I said, because you guys already published a book back in 1992 by Robert Drews called The End of the Bronze Age. I said, it was a good book. I don't really agree with it, but, and he says, but it's been like 15 years. Haven't things changed? And I said, sure. And he's like, okay, good. So you'll write it. I said, no. He's like, why not? I said, I want to write about what collapsed. I don't want to write about the collapse. I want to write about Minoans, Mycenaeans, people in Ugara, the Hittites and all that. And he said, all right, I'll make you a deal. If you begin and end the book with the collapse, you can write about whatever you want in the middle. And I said, you got a deal. And so that's how the book came about. It came out in 2014, and within a year, and I think it was just a coincidence, tons of new data started coming out. And I was just like, oh my God. And by 2019, it became clear to me that we needed a new edition. And so I went to Rob and I said, can I do a revised? He's like, sure. So, and then COVID happened. I had plenty of time on my hands. And so the revised version came out in 2021. And I think that's the version you guys have here, is the revised one. Right, good. And then we thought, wait, we need something for another audience. We need it for ages 7 to 17. So I hooked up with Glynis Fox, who's a wonderful cartoonist and an archaeologist. And we put together this version, full color, 250 pages. And it's completely accurate to the revised version. We had so much fun with this. We introduced 2 new characters. And in fact, Glynis and I parachute in from time to time. So you all played Where's Waldo at one point, right? So now you can play Where's Eric, right, in there. Anyway, it's lots of fun. And what it turned out is we not only reached the ages 7 to 17, we also reached the adults who don't like to read, but like comic books, right? And I know this for a fact because on Amazon, one person wrote, I could never get through Cline's original book. Try as I might. I read the graphic version in an afternoon, and now I know what he was talking about. I'm like, okay, so we hit another audience. So anyway, and you've got that here as well. All right, okay, that's my pitch. All right, so what caused the collapse? Well, when I was in graduate school at Penn, I was taught, and Kevin probably was as well, that it was the Sea Peoples that did this. And we'll get to them in just a moment. But they said they claimed it, it was it, that was it was just the Sea Peoples. I think that they are unfairly blamed. I think they're kind of a bogeyman. In fact, I used to use them to scare my kids when they wouldn't go to sleep, right? Go to bed now or the Sea Peoples are going to get you. Oh, no, not that. And they went running off. So if it's not the Sea Peoples that are solely responsible, what could it be? So people have suggested a variety of things, and I list it for you here. Drought, famine, invaders, earthquakes. And that's what I do towards the end of the book, the last couple of chapters, is I go through each of these, the pros and the cons, and I weigh them. And in the end, after having weighed everything, I decided, yes, it's all of the above. It's a perfect storm. Because if you get hit with a drought or famine, it will probably kill a lot of people in your society, but it won't end the society. If you get hit with invaders or an earthquake, it will be devastating. It will kill a lot of people, but it probably won't end your society. But what if you have 2 or 3 of these, or 4 of them, either at the same time or in rapid succession, where you can't get back and recover from one of them before the next one hits? And I think that's what we've got in this particular case. So I called it a perfect storm of catastrophes. But I also, at one point, if you read the book carefully, you will see that I, at one point, call it an unfortunate series of events, which, if you're familiar with Lemony Snicket, is from there. And I used to read him to my kids. And so I actually have a game that I play with my editors and publishers of trying to sneak references like that into the book. So at another point, I would think I was talking about fighting with the Assyrians, and I said, resistance is futile. Right, so yeah, if you don't know what that is, Google it. Right, anyway, so with the sequel, just to look ahead, in the sequel, we had been watching Hamilton almost every night during COVID. It was on Disney Plus, and we decided that there was a quote from Hamilton for every situation. So in the sequel, there's no fewer than 3 things from Hamilton. I won't tell you what they are. You got to go look for yourself. But yeah, anyway. So I think it was all of the above. And the interesting thing was all that data that came out after 2014 all supported what I had said originally, which I was very happy about. But I decided I needed to put them into the revised version. So what I'm going to do for this first really quick part, not going to go down deep into each of those causes, but just to show you some of the new stuff that came up from 2014 with like 1 slide for each. So here, as an example, drought. Every red dot you see on this map represents another archaeological excavation or a site that has presented scientific evidence for a drought back then. And not just any drought. This is a drought that lasted between 150 and 300 years in places. So it's a mega drought, right? They talk about the drought down in California now being a mega drought, and that's only like 10 years old. Try, 150 years. So, and the evidence is from different things. You can see I've written in the caption here. It's from caves. It's from stalagmites. There's one stalagmite in Greece that stopped growing because there wasn't enough water. It's also the sediments at the bottom of lakes and lagoons. It's pollen analysis. So there is no doubt now that there was a drought in this area. And we've even got textual evidence then for the famine that it caused. It can be hard to find famine in the archaeological record, but if you've got a textual mention of it, there you go. So here is one good example. This is a letter from the Egyptian pharaoh, Merneptah, that he sent to the king of Ugarit, that city on the north coast of Syria. And in it, rather interesting, he's quoting back a letter that the Ugaritic king had sent to him. He says, "You had written to me in the land of Ugarit, there's a severe hunger. May my Lord save the land, and may the king give grain to save my life and to save the citizens." So I think you can agree that there is famine in Ugarit because the king is saying this. And this is one of the new letters that was published. Came out in 2016. The French had been sitting on these letters for more than a decade. And in 2016, they published them in French. And then my friend Yuri Cohen, the Assyriologist, 2020, he came out in English with them. And he was the one, we had been at Tel Kabri digging in 2019, came down and had dinner with him, and he just looked at me over dinner and says, "You need a new edition of your book." And I'm like, "Why?" He's like, "Because the French just published all their stuff." And I went and I looked, I'm like, "Oh my word." And I sent an email from the airport to Rob saying we need a new edition. So this is one of the new texts that they had just published in 2016. Now, that's not the first that we had had in terms of textual evidence. We had already known, for example, letters from the Hittite king and even one queen, and they're writing down to Egypt, which they had sometimes, been at war with them. And the king is saying, "Don't you know there's a famine in my land? It's become, plenty's become famine. It's a matter of life and death." And the Egyptian king sent ships with grain trying to help them out. All right, what about invaders? We have a standard set of texts that have come down to us. We actually know those sea peoples, the ones that I don't think were totally responsible, but were victims as much as they were oppressors. They came actually twice. They came in 1207, back in the time of Merneptah, that same guy that wrote to the king of Ugarit. And then they came again 30 years later in the time of Ramses III in 1177. And yes, that's where I got the title of the book. So the quote that you see here in two small letters is from the mortuary temple of Ramses III, where he describes beating the sea peoples in a land battle and a naval battle. And he actually tells us the direction that they're coming from. They came across Hate, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Dalashia. We know these places. Hate, those are the Hittites up in Turkey. Kode and Carchemish, in modern terms, that's where Turkey meets Syria. Arzawa, western coast of Turkey, and then Alashia, well, that's Bronze Age Cyprus. So we know they're coming across. In fact, I think they started in the Western Mediterranean, Sicily, Sardinia, northern Italy, swept across Greece, swept across Turkey in modern terms, swept across Cyprus. And then he says a camp was set up in one place in Amur. We know that's North Syria, just south of Ugarit. And then they head for Egypt. So the Egyptians had plenty of warning, and they actually managed to beat them both times. But he also says, down bottom, if you can see, their confederation was the Peleset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. So we actually have the names of these sea peoples, and it's us that call them the sea peoples. The French invented that in the 1800s. So we've been playing linguistic games ever since. Who are these people and where they come from? I'll tell you right now, we have no site that we've ever excavated that can tell us that's where they came from. We're still looking for it. Somebody once asked me if they gave me $1 million and I could dig anywhere, what would I do? And I said, I would go to Sicily, Sardinia, Italy, and go looking for the sea peoples, but we haven't found them yet. The Denyen, they might be Homer's Danaans, the Mycenaeans, not for sure, but the only one we know are the Peleset, and those are the Philistines, which the Bible mentions. The rest of them are kind of up for grabs. So the sea peoples are out there. But then we have these new texts. And again, this is one of the ones that the French published. Again, it's from the guy at Ugarit. This is from the last king named Amurapi. And he's writing up to the Hittite viceroy in Carchemish. And he says, look, I wrote to you 2 times, 3 times regarding the enemy. May my lord know that now the enemy forces are stationed at Rashu, which is the second port of Ugarit. It's been excavated, Ras Ibn Hani, and their avant-garde forces were sent to Ugarit. Now may my lord send me forces and chariots and save me. Well, even if those reinforcements were sent, which I don't think they were, they came too late. Because when the French excavated Ugarit, they found a meter of destruction with bodies in the streets, arrowheads in the buildings, and the site was abandoned for the next 400 years. So there were definitely invaders. The problem is, I've written to you regarding the enemy. That's all he says. I could throttle that ancient scribe. Why didn't he say, come on, the Peleset, the Shardana, the Shurdan, the Shekelesh? No, it's the enemy. So we're no closer to finding out who did it. But we now have more evidence for invaders. Same thing with earthquakes, right? So we know there were earthquakes back then. We're continuing to get more evidence. The two top and bottom on the left, that's Mycenae, the famous Lion Gate. How many people have been there? Right? You know, it's built on an active fault zone, right? So it was destroyed many times. And in fact, Noni Milanas, the daughter of the excavator, sent me that skeleton. It was a young woman, about 17 years old, and Noni was 17 herself when she excavated her. She had sheltered in a doorway, and that rock that you see next to her head was actually lodged in the skull. So she had been killed when the doorway she was sheltering in had collapsed on her. Normally, that's the safest place, but not so much here. And then bottom right, Ugarit itself got hit with an earthquake. And then, of course, Troy 6, you've got the earthquake there, right? And that wall there, that's not supposed to be tilting, right? That's when you have an earthquake. So we definitely have more and more earthquakes. We've also got now disease. Disease can be very hard to find archaeologically as well, but in this particular case, we have the mummy of Ramses V, who is a little bit later, 1140, but he's still in the approximate time zone. And if you look closely, you look along his jawline, he's got smallpox, right? And in fact, there is a papyrus, which is now in Italy, in the Turin Museum, that says that he and other members of his family died of the plague, and it looks like it was smallpox, and that in fact, they dug new tombs for them in the Valley of the Kings. And then after the tombs had been dug, they gave the workmen a month's leave at full pay, and they closed the Valley of the Kings for 6 months. It was probably the world's first quarantine that's actually been recorded. So we've definitely got disease there as well. Put them all together, and what you've got is a systems collapse. This was a term that Colin Renfrew at Cambridge coined in the late 70s, and it fits here. Systems collapse, it's when your central administration collapses, it's when your centralized economy collapses. The traditional 1%, they either die or they move, and then you've got all these settlement shifts and everything else. So systems collapse, definitely the end of the late Bronze Age. But that's not the only one. When the Harappan civilization goes down in India, when the Maya go down, even when the Romans go down, every time it's a systems collapse. And the thing about that is it can take up to a century to take place. And that's exactly what happens at the end of the late Bronze Age. I'll be the first to admit 1177 is a clickbait title, and I fought it the entire time. And Rob said to me, if you don't like the title, what should it be? And I said, life in 1200 BC is very different from life in 1100 and completely different from life in 1000 BC. And he said, well, that might be true, but that won't fit on the cover. And so he's like, trust me, numbers sell. It's going to be called 1177. And I said, but that's not the year civilization fell. That's the year the Sea Peoples came the second time. He's like, potato, potato. So he won, I trust him, whatever. But so the way I sleep at night, 1177 is to the late Bronze Age collapse, as like 476 AD is to the fall of Rome. We know Rome didn't fall in that year. Took most of the 5th century, and even then you've got the Eastern Roman Empire for another 1,000 years. But that's what we teach, at least down where I am, the kids in 6th grade and 10th grade. That's it. So for me, it's a benchmark, right? So take it with a grain of salt. All right, so we've got a systems collapse. Essentially what happened is the world as they had known it for 500 years changed, not quite overnight, but within 20 or 30 years, and it transformed. So while we had late Bronze Age people like the Hittites, now in the Iron Age, Turkey was split up. And you've got the Phrygians there, you've got the Urartians, you've got all the, whatever you want to call them, the Neo-Hittites, the Syro-Anatolians, whatever is the term these days. But it's a new world order that comes up following the collapse in the Iron Age from about 1200 down to 800 BC. So that's where the sequel came about. Rob came to me and said, first book's been pretty successful, you want to write a sequel? And I said, no. And he's like, wait, I've heard this before. why don't you want to do a sequel? And I said, because I'm a Bronze Age person. I don't do the Iron Age. I don't even like the Iron Age people. Right? At parties, they're on one side of the room, I'm on the other. Right? And he's like, get over it. Like, okay, fine. So, and I will actually admit, it's actually kind of an interesting period because of the resilience that they had to show. So in the sequel, I was trying to figure out how we got from the left-hand side in the late Bronze Age to the right-hand side in the Iron Age. And we get new, smaller kingdoms jumping up everywhere, including like Northern Kingdom of Israel, Southern Kingdom of Judah, Moab, Ammon, and so on. So I was trying to figure out how you get from one to the other. And I originally wrote the book the same way I had written the first one, that is, chronologically. First book goes 15th century, 14th, 13th, 12th. This one, I started 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th. And then I was at like the penultimate version. I was about to send it in, and I did one last read. And like I was in chapter 3 on the 10th century, and I got whiplash. I think I want to coin this term. It's literary whiplash, not literal, but literary, because in that chapter, I'm like, okay, in the 10th century, Neo-Assyrians are doing this, Neo-Babylonians are doing this, Cyprus is doing the Phoenicians, and I'm like, I can't keep it straight, and I wrote it. And I thought, okay, there's a problem. So I tried an experiment, and I reorganized it geographically. And I think that worked. Because what I figured out is we've actually got 8 case studies, that G8, 8 case studies of what to do and what not to do if your society collapses. So in the sequel, like chapter 1 is Egypt and Canaan, chapter 2 is Assyria and Babylon, chapter 3, Cypriots and Phoenicians, and so on. The first 5 chapters are basically a history book with archaeology. The analyses I left for chapter 6. And that's what I want to do for the rest of our time tonight, is leave you guys to go read chapters 1 through 5, and I'll focus on chapter 6. And we'll see if you agree with me, because I went out on a limb, and I had the temerity to rank them as to how well they did. And you may or may not agree with me, so I'll be interested to see what you say. But the other thing, I got dinged a fair amount by my academic colleagues in their reviews from the first book. I don't know if any of you have ever read academic reviews, but like you got to watch out for reviewer number 2, especially, and so on. One of the things they said to me is, it's not just your title that's clickbait, it's the whole premise. They said it was not a collapse. They said it was just a transformation. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Somewhere between 40 and 60% of the population in Greece died or migrated. That's not a transformation, that's a collapse. And maybe as much as 75% in Mesopotamia died or migrated. That's not a collapse, or that's not a transformation, it's a collapse. So what I tried to do, I wanted my cake and eat it too. So this is the Pink Palace, where the Getty puts up their fellows. And if you take a look at the umbrella and the seats there, and you're far away, it looks really nice. It's a nice high-res photo. But if you get right up close to it, it gets pixelated, and you kind of lose the picture for everything. Now, this is not an original observation. To me, it's what Norm Yoffe and Patricia McEnany said happens when you look at any collapse up close. You can always get a yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. And I actually think that a better analogy is to look at a collapse as if it's an impressionist painting, right? From far away, you can see the picture, but if you get right up close, sometimes you get lost in the dabs of paint. So overall, what I decided in writing the sequel, like I said, I wanted my cake and eat it too. I said, the network collapses. And there's no argument about that. They are disconnected. The network is what collapses. The individual societies then had to deal with it. Some of them also collapsed, others coped, others adapted, and some transformed. So I'm like, there, take that. It's everything, right? And that got a slightly better response. So I think it's both a collapse and a transformation. Now, fortunately, there's been a lot of interest recently in the collapse of various things, especially ancient societies. The granddaddy of them all is Joseph Tainter, and you see him in the upper right there, The Collapse of Complex Societies. The one that most people have read, though, is Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. Anybody here read that? All right. Okay. So the one thing about all these books on collapse is they're usually dealing with one society, right? Even Jared Diamond's book, he's got one society per chapter. What we're dealing with here with the Late Bronze Age is 8 societies collapsing or transforming simultaneously. So it's a little bit different. But we've also now got a new set of evidence where people are trying to look more and more at what happens after collapse. So these are 2 conference volumes that have appeared in the last 10, 20 years after collapse and beyond collapse. So I found those very useful in writing the sequel as well. And there's also been, of course, as you all know, an increasing interest in resilience. I mean, you can't turn around today without somebody talking about resilience or being resilient or something like that. The problem is, depending on what academic discipline you're in, everybody has a different definition of what is resilience. So finally, in 2011, the Department of Homeland Security asked the National Research Council to come up with a definition of resilience. And I thought this was pretty good. Continue to operate under stress, adapt to adversity, and recover functionality after a crisis. And that's exactly what we're looking at with the Late Bronze Age collapse. So I thought this was a useful definition for me. But I would also ask, isn't that just the usual order, right? Empires rise, empires collapse, comes and goes. Or to quote Hamilton, oceans rise, empires fall, right? So there, I gave away one of the 3 in the sequel, right? But there's 2 more, you need to look for them. Right, this is what is known as the adaptive cycle, and it's used in a number of different disciplines, from environmental studies to biology to everything else. Basically, it's things come and go, and in our case, it's the omega in the lower right, the release part of this cycle, which is the Late Bronze Age collapse. And it's always followed with the upper left, the alpha phase, in which there is recovery and reorganization. And that alpha is the phase when there's innovation and invention. And I think that's what we've got here in the Iron Age after the collapse. So I thought the adaptive cycle would be useful to use here as well. And then the third thing, besides resilience and adaptive cycle, I didn't know why. It's one of those things where I just collect things and I don't know why until suddenly one night I woke up, oh, that's why I'm doing it. And in this particular case, I was collecting everything I could find from the IPCC, right, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They won a Nobel Prize back in 2007, and I was collecting everything that they had written, and I didn't know why. It was all free, open access. I could download it, no problem. And then one day, I figured out why. And it was because when I was at the Getty, which was fall of 2021, I got there, and they had a welcome lunch with all of the fellows and the staff at the Getty, both the Research Institute and the Villa. And I found myself just sitting next to the curator of Russian art, which was cool, but I had absolutely nothing in common with her. We're chatting, and she says, so what brings you here? And I said, I'm studying climate change and resilience in antiquity. And without missing a beat, she says, oh, you'll want to talk to my husband. Like, why would I talk to your husband? And she's like, well, he works at RAND and he's a member of the IPCC. Have you heard of them? I'm like, oh my God, yes, I've heard of them. And she's like, I'll arrange lunch. And I went back and I Googled her husband's name, and it turned out he's one of the authors of this, which had become by that point my Bible, because this came out in 2012. And it's the first time they had talked about climate change and resilience and mitigation and adaptation. Usually they're talking about it in terms of things like Hurricane Katrina and the flooding of New Orleans. They don't actually have much archaeology in here. And I told them they needed to talk to archaeologists. So I don't know if he's going to do it or not. So when I had lunch with him, I said to him, look, in this publication, which is now like 12 years old, I said, you talked about extreme impact events. He says, yes, we did. And I said, you defined it as either a single extreme event or the persistence of conditions like leading to drought and all of that. He's like, yes, I know, I helped write this, right? And I said, well, let me tell you about the late Bronze Age collapse, which he didn't really know much about. And I described it. And at the end, I said, would you consider that to have been an extreme impact event? And he says, yeah, absolutely. It would definitely. So I'm like, okay, good. Because you guys talk about 3 ways to come back from an extreme impact event. One of them is coping. And that's like if you're just trying to get through to tomorrow, right? You're just going to cope. If you're trying to look a little further ahead and go, let's say a month out, you would try to adapt to it. And if you said, this can never happen again, right? We can never let New Orleans be flooded again by another hurricane, you're going to transform to make sure it doesn't happen. And he said, yeah, you could definitely do that. And I said, could I try and rank our different societies according? And he says, you could try it. I don't know if it'll work, but. So in the book, I put in a table with all the definitions. And you notice at the very bottom with the asterisks, I put in my sources, right? So I'm not plagiarizing anybody, and you can check me out on all this. And then I put in the table in which I ranked the 8 from 1 to 5, 1 being the best, 5 being the worst. So I think the societies that did the best are the Phoenicians, who are central Canaanites, that is modern-day Lebanon, and the people from Cyprus. I think they did the best. In fact, they're not even just resilient, they are anti-fragile. That's when you flourish in a time of chaos. That's when you take advantage and you just take off. So I put them up in number 1. Number 5, I put the Hittites. Don't be a Hittite. They did not adapt. They disappeared. They left a little bit, Neo-Hittites, but they disappeared. And then in between, Assyrians and Babylonians, number 2, Egypt, number 3, mainland Greece, the Minoans and Mycenaeans, and Crete, number 4. So I'm expecting this is where I'll get the most pushback from various people. In fact, I was giving a talk on this topic in Prague, of all places, right? We've got Prague in common. And one of the Egyptology graduate students stood up when I put up this table, and he yelled, "We're number 1 or we're nothing." And I said, then I'm afraid you're nothing, because you're not number 1. And I looked at him and, and I took pity. I said, I could be persuaded to put you up to number 2, but you're not number 1. He's like, okay, I'll take number 2. All right. So here's why I think, and again, I won't spend too much time. If you're really interested, you can read the book. But in number 1 with the Phoenicians and the Cypriots, I put the Phoenicians up there because of the alphabet and purple dye. Right? They don't invent either of them, but they standardize both of them, and then they spread them out across the Mediterranean. And calling them anti-fragile, this is from the title of a book that Nassim Nicholas Taleb wrote back in early 2000s, Anti-Fragile Things That Gain from Disorder. So when I wrote to him and I said, do you think your term anti-fragile applies? He says, yeah, absolutely. And I said, good, because I want to apply it to the Phoenicians. And he's like, good, because I'm their descendant. And he's actually of Lebanese descent. So he was real happy with this. If you don't know his name already, he's the guy that popularized the phrase black swan back in the day. So he had black swan and anti-fragile. Anyway, so I think the Phoenicians and the Cypriots are up that way. I picked the Phoenicians in part because when they standardized the alphabet, they brought it all across the Mediterranean. It went to Greece, became the Greek alphabet, brought it over to Italy, became the Latin alphabet. And of course, we're still using that today, right? We use the Latin alphabet to write English and French and German and Spanish and Italian and all of that. So we're actually still using a variant of the Phoenician alphabet, if you will. And as I say, they spread purple dye as well. We know a lot about them. The archaeology has shown us now that they would not have called themselves Phoenicians. That's the much later Greek name by like Herodotus and Thucydides, they would have said, I'm from Beirut, I'm from Byblos, I'm from Tyre, the city-states. And so we know some of the kings, like not just Hiram of Tyre from the Bible, but an earlier Hiram and then various other people as well. Cyprus we don't know as much about in the Iron Age, in part because we're still trying to read their inscriptions from that time period, but they also seem to have had city-states at that time. What they contributed, they had been the main source for copper back in the Bronze Age, right? Tin was coming from Afghanistan and elsewhere, but the copper came from Cyprus. They pivoted after the collapse and became, as far as we can tell, the first country that started making iron. They were at the forefront. Right? They probably come across it while doing bronze and copper. That's a totally different way from making iron, but they look like the first ones to do it. So I know this is a bad picture, but this is a bimetallic knife. It was found at Paraty on mainland Greece. The blade is iron, but the handle, the rivets that are holding the handle together are made out of bronze. So two different metals. And what they did is they sent them over to Greece on the one side and to the southern Levant on the other. And they also seem to have been very nice about it. They're like, if you like this, here's how you make it. And they told them how to do it. And of course, each of the countries, iron ore is in every country. It's much easier to get. It's just you have to figure out how to smelt it. And so they apparently sent out the technology along with the artifacts. So I put them up again in my first category, because remember, this alpha period is the phase of innovation and invention. So they are up in my number one. So again, you can see that alpha phase. So I think both of them are up there. I won't spend much longer on the others, just Assyrians and Babylonians of Mesopotamia. They do pretty well, but not as well. So I put them in my second category. I think in part it's because they were on the Tigris and Euphrates. They still had a water source, and that helped. And there they kept the traditional king, the law code, the writing, all of that. And eventually the Neo-Assyrians would spread over the entire Near East. And by the 9th and into the 8th centuries, they conquer the whole ancient Near East. We know all of their kings. We've got all of their inscriptions. You can't always believe what they say, though. Neo-Assyrians, they always won. They never lost, right? But I'll give you one example on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which is pretty famous. You see Jehu from the northern kingdom of Israel bowing down in this inscription. By the way, I don't think that's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. I could be wrong, but I could never find this, but never mind. And Shalmaneser on that same inscription talks about the Battle of Karkar in 853 and says he killed 14,000 of the enemy troops, so many that their bodies dammed up the Orontes River. I think that might be a bit hyperbole, right? But anyway, but it is true that they did take over the whole Near East. Egyptians, I put them in category 3. They didn't disappear completely, but they didn't do as well as they could have. This is known as the Third Intermediate Period in Egypt. We've got all the names of the kings, and it's a time period where it wasn't terrible. You had people like this so-called Silver Pharaoh. His tomb, by the way, is the second richest in Egypt, just behind King Tut's. Nobody's ever heard of it because it was found in 1939 and got eclipsed by World War II. All right? But so you've got people like that, but you've also got periods here where Egypt is ruled by 3 or even 4 people at the same time, each in different areas. And I don't think that is a very good system of government. One of the Egyptologists at NYU said it wasn't fair of me to compare this period to the Bronze Age. And I said, why isn't it fair? That's exactly what I'm doing with all the other societies. She's like, I think Egypt was better off with 3 or 4 kings. I'm like, really? Tell that to King Tut. Tell that to Ramses II. Anyway, so I put them in group 3. You can see why I was thinking that. But you can also see why the Egyptology grad student in Prague said we should be up at number 2 or number 1. So it's flexible. It's flexible. But I don't think they did as well as the others, even though you do have people like Sheshonq, who might be the biblical Shishak, and who comes up and captures Megiddo and all of that in about 925. So Egypt, I thought, what we used to call the old gentleman's sea, right? I think they're right in there. So category 3. Category 4, my favorite people, Minoans and Mycenaeans, they're right in there. They don't disappear. Sorry about that. That's my alarm. I'm not kidding. You don't all have Indiana Jones as your alarm? Am I dating myself? Possible. Anyway, so I know I'm running out of time. I will wrap up here. But yeah, okay, so the Minoans and Mycenaeans, they don't do as well as the others. The one thing, though, I want to make clear here, and I actually open the sequel with this, just like the Sea Peoples are, I think, getting bad blame back for the original collapse, so too the Dorian invasion for the Iron Age is just wrong. We're told by Herodotus, Thucydides, that the Dorians came in about 80 years after the Trojan War, and they ended the Mycenaeans. But if that's correct, there's no evidence for it. None whatsoever. No evidence. None. Zip. Nada. Nothing. Forget about it. It is an invasion without invaders. There's no archaeological evidence for it whatsoever. Now, what there might be is migration that takes place over a couple of decades or a couple of generations. But that's very different from like a blitzkrieg invasion. So I started the book out with that to get rid of the Dorian invasion. I also end getting rid of it as a dark age. So I don't think it's a dark age. I think we should just call it the Iron Age. But the Minoans and Mycenaeans, they basically had to go down to ground zero. They lost pretty much everything. They lost the art of writing. Linear B goes away. That was an early form of Greek. We don't have that anymore. They lost the art of huge building. They lost all kinds of things. But it is a permeable membrane because, for instance, we know that the Mycenaeans were already worshiping Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and Athena. And of course, those go on through and make it into the Iron Age and then the Classical Age. But some things did not. Back in the Late Bronze Age, the king in Greece was the Wanax, and the Basileus was a much lower guy. In the Iron Age, there's no Wanax anymore. That completely goes away. And suddenly the Basileus becomes the king in each of the areas. So it's kind of a permeable membrane, but they really had to go down to ground zero. Remember I said between 40 and 60% of the population died or migrated, and they have to start rebuilding. In fact, of all the G8, the Greeks are the last to come back of the people that come back, right? So by the end, or rather the beginning of the 8th century, they're back, right? 776 BC, the Olympics, they're back, right? In fact, Rob has persuaded me to write a third book in the Unintended Trilogy, right? He asked me if I wanted to do a third book. I said no, and then I agreed. So the next book is going to be called 776 BC, because I got the 2 sevens in there, right? I wanted a whole nother title, but never mind. Anyway, so the Greeks come back, and we're finding out more about them. And it turns out, for example, that Knossos in the Iron Age was much bigger than we had thought. So this is the beauty of archaeology. What we think we know now could be completely overturned by next week. So, but I still put the Minoans and Mycenaeans down in 4. Let's see, right? And then 5, as I said, don't be a Hittite, right? They completely collapsed, as did the Canaanites in the southern Levant. You can see the Hittites flatline, basically. And they completely go away. We actually now have new evidence for the drought that hit. It's from radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology from Gordian. We know there was a drought, 1198 to 1196, which is part of what's going on. But we also know that the capital city was going to go down anyway. There was a fight in the royal family, and the capital city had actually been deserted. And when it was lit on fire, there wasn't anybody living there. So I think the Hittites would have gone down anyway. And like I say, they are overtaken then by the Phrygians and the Urartians and so on. But there were some people that hung on. This is, again, North Syria, in the same area that Ugarit is. And down there where the Hittites had captured this, it was basically a little tiny part of their empire. And when the main part up in Anatolia went away, these guys in North Syria continued. And they continue through the Iron Age. These are the new Hittites or the Neo-Hittites. And they keep going. They've got kings, they've got the laws, they're writing in Luwian, like the royal family had done. They actually have names like Shuppi-Luliuma and so on. And so they continue on until the Assyrians defeat them and assimilate them, because in that case, resistance really was futile. And if you want to read about this, there's all kinds of great work going on, James Osborne at Chicago. But I just wanted to show you, we know a number of the kings from this period too. And one of them, who took the name Shuppi-Luliuma, you can see him on the right. And I just wanted to point him out and ask you if you agree with me. Did he really think that was a good portrait? I mean, did he sit for that? And he's like, great, you've got me. Like, oh my word. Anyway, so he's one of the last guys here. But that's the last gasp. So I would say, don't be a Hittite. And then down in the southern Levant, where we had the Canaanites, their material culture basically goes away. After the collapse of the Late Bronze Age, there are very few references to the Canaanites. Instead, what we get are references to the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites and the Israelites and the Judahites. We've got all these little kingdoms that take over, and the Canaanites themselves, I don't know if they're wiped out, like the book of Joshua says, or if they assimilate, like the book of Judges says. I don't know what went on, but either way, I would say they were not resilient, because we don't see any Canaanites after that. Either that, or they're completely resilient, and they are the new people. It could be either way. So I actually hedge my bets, and then I put them into category 5, and the footnote says, I'm willing to go up to category 2 if anybody can persuade me. All right, so I kept my options open. All right, and so that goes into the whole biblical question of when did the Exodus take place, when did the Israelite conquest take place, but that's a whole nother lecture for another time. Let me wrap up by saying this is where some of the new science comes in. Well, it's not so new anymore, but Daphne Landgut is looking at the pollen, and she actually says that the weather got a bit better in maybe about 1150, and they could plant olive trees again, and she thinks that's what contributed to the rise of these little kingdoms in what had been the southern Levant. And other new studies too, Erez Ben Yosef, who's at UC San Diego and Tel Aviv University, thinks that people that had been nomadic are now settling down, like the Edomites. So there's a lot of new information that has been coming out. I don't think I need a third edition of the book yet, but I think you will agree with me that pretty much the aftermath of the collapse was varied. Some did really well and transformed. Others did okay and kind of adapted. Others failed to adapt and just disappeared entirely. And then we've got new entities. And like I said, this really is a new world order in the Iron Age, when people come back or didn't come back from the collapse. Now, as to why some came back and others didn't, I don't know. I don't have an answer. I think it has to do with vulnerability. I think it has to do with fragility. Some of these that looked like they were going to be resilient and rigorous turned out not to be. I think the Hittites were like a tree that's hollow inside, and you don't know it is until the wind knocks it over. And same maybe with the Mycenaeans. So that is a question that remains to be answered by my colleagues, hopefully. And why were they? And why were the Assyrians not? I think these are good questions for the future. So to wrap it up and to make it relevant to today. So this is, we need to study the humanities, because if you know your ancient history, you can either do it all again or not do it again. So I included this table at the end, 7 lessons to learn from the collapse that might or might not be useful. They're common sense. You don't actually have to read the book to come up with these, right? Have multiple contingency plans in place, like have a generator in case your electricity fails, and then have something else if your generator fails, that kind of thing. You need to be resilient, and I think you need to be self-sufficient, but not isolationist. You need to depend on your friends when you can. I think of all these, number 4 is the most important: be innovative and inventive. During COVID and afterward, I got very, very worried by the supply chain shortages, right? And I actually think that things like rare earths, like lithium, used to make the chips in everything from computers to cars, we need to get a little more inventive about that and figure out what we're going to do if we can't get it. And then things like number 5, preparing for extreme weather conditions. You know, if they come, you're going to be ready, and if they don't come, so what, right? So I would err on the side of caution. And then water. I already mentioned the Assyrians and the Babylonians did well because of the Tigris and Euphrates. I think the Egyptians, even though they didn't do as well, they still are up in category 3 because of the Nile. And in fact, of the big 4, there's 4 out of the 8 that were the biggest: Egyptians, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians. Assyrians, Babylonians, and Egyptians are all on major water sources. The Hittites are not, and they're the only one of the 4 that actually go down. And I've been told on pretty good authority that most of the wars for the next century are going to be fought over water. And so I think this holds lessons back then. And then, of course, as any historian would tell you, you always got to keep the working class happy, or there could be problems, right? So I think we need to think about that as well. So let me end by asking you, do you think today we are facing a similar situation to what they faced back in 1177? I think so. I think we've got climate change, we've got famines and droughts, we've got earthquakes, we have rebellions, we've got disease, we've got migrants and refugees. We've got everything they had, and they collapsed. To say that we're too big to fail is hubristic. Every civilization, every society in human history has either collapsed completely or transformed enough that you wouldn't really recognize it in its new iteration. So I'm a little bit worried about that, especially when you realize what's happened to us just since, say, 2008, right? And I actually think that if the financial crisis of 2008 had happened a dozen years later and had coincided with COVID, I'm not sure we'd be talking here today, right? That would have been 2 major things at once, but they were a decade apart. But you remember when that ship got stuck in the Suez Canal and suddenly we couldn't get toilet paper, right? So for me, the question is not, are we going to collapse? The question is, when are we going to collapse? Because it's going to happen. I don't know if it'll be next week, next year, 10 years from now, a century from now, but it's going to happen. It's, I would say, pretty inevitable. So the other question I would say then, when it collapses and we're faced with what to do, are we going to be Phoenicians and anti-fragile, or are we going to be Mycenaeans and have to start from scratch? Obviously, I don't know the answer. We're going to have to leave that for future archaeologists and historians. But I would remind you that John Wooden, I had the great, I was lucky enough to watch him coach his last 2 years at UCLA. Those teams that went 88-0 without being beaten. I was 10 years old. But he used to tell his basketball teams, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And I think it's the same thing. We need to prepare or we're going to fail. And I would remind you what Mark Twain supposedly said, history might not repeat, but it does rhyme. And I think we're in the middle of a rhyming couplet right now. And so I don't want to be a Cassandra or a Chicken Little, but I'm a bit worried. I think we need to prepare. And if we prepare, we might not fail. If we don't prepare, I think we're in for it. And this is why I would say studying ancient history and the humanities is relevant to today. If we're willing to listen, we can learn about not just the past, but also the future. If we don't listen to ancient history, frankly, we're doomed. Thank you.